There was a shift. There was a shift in the moral clarity of the country. I'm inspired by northern New York, where kids and their mothers are taken by ICE agents and illegally detained without due process. And the teachers and the principal organized with their community, were in the news, organizing protests, calling every day, eventually got the kids released.
I'm your host, Eileen and I'd like to welcome you to Political Forgiveness Voices of Peace, a podcast of hope where forgiveness and political forgiveness intersect to create a better world. With great pleasure, I want to introduce my guest, Julia Roig. Julia is the founder and chief network weaver of the Horizon Project, where she focuses on strengthening connective tissue between social justice, bridge building, and democracy. She's an expert on narrative engagement across difference to help build broader alliances for pro-democracy movements. Welcome, Julia.
Thanks so much, Eileen. I'm thrilled to have the invitation to be with you today.
Julia, I know that you've had more than 30 years of experience working with democratic change and conflict transformation around the world. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind telling us a bit about yourself and the Horizon Project.
Sure. Yes, my professional background is one of more international peace building and democracy promotion. I was trained as a lawyer, but very early on in my career, followed my husband actually overseas and was based in Bogota, Colombia for about 5 years, and then lived in Serbia for another couple of years, and then moved back to DC with a thud with two small children. And I led an international non-for-profit focusing on peaceful democratic change for about 14 years called Partners Global, and really learned a lot from my local colleagues that we were investing in. And as the years went on and our own conflict dynamics started heating up in the United States, I thought, how could I do this work overseas and not do the work at home? So we established Horizons in 2022 as an organizing platform to do the kind of ecosystem level organizing to bring together very diverse communities that are often siloed, which I had experienced so often in my international work, those who have different theories of change about how the world works and what's needed, and that really finding each other across these differences and silos can help improve our collective action and make it more powerful. Together with Maria Stefan, who co-leads Horizons with me, we have been at it since 2022.
Obviously, there's so many problems going on now within our own country that we're taking those experiences we've learned from people abroad. So, what have you learned in how to bring communities together to build what you talk about in terms of the connective tissue?
Yeah. First of all, it'd be probably helpful to define what we mean by communities and how Horizons, at least, is interacting with a lot of different communities. If you take an ecosystem approach to change making, you're working at a lot of different levels. You're working at connecting grassroots level to state level to national level to even international level organizing. And what does that mean to be in right relationship with each other? But then you're also organizing across those who maybe have a more social justice approach to change or a rights-based approach. In the international field, it's human rights. We might talk about civil rights or social justice here in the US, with those who are also doing more bridge building, depolarization work, dialogue-focused work, and then those who think about institutional democratic reform. So those are really broad circles of communities, of fields of folks who are both professionals, but also just citizens who care deeply about making change in the world, who are trying to tap into either institutions or frameworks or ways of doing their work. Where I am placing my efforts is those who think about making change differently, to find each other across communities of practice, let's say, to then be able to be complementary or to just acknowledge where there may be tensions. Like some of us are raising the heat right now. We're disrupting complacency. We're making people not look away from harms. that can be in direct tension with those who want to bring down the heat so that we can find each other. Sometimes we talk about unity or civility or the ability to be in problem-solving mode together. So these are in tension with each other, and yet they can also be complementary with the right framing and relationship building.
You mentioned that there's a framework of how societies heal and sequencing that needs to be incorporated into our conversation in the United States. Can you talk more about this framework?
It's not my framework, and there's many frameworks, and I would just like to acknowledge, Eileen, there's so many people and organizations and folks who are thinking about our issues systemically right now. I do think that in order for us to move forward with this systems approach, we need to get out of solutionism, one size fits all. So it's very linear thinking. When you say communities, how do communities heal? People think about grassroots local work as where the work is really needed, and that we should be focusing our efforts on healing our neighborhoods, feeling a sense of agency that they can make a difference in their zip codes. And this is so true. When we connect that together, it becomes a bigger thing. There are cultural differences, there are bigger institutional differences. And quite honestly, we need the national level advocacy and positioning because we're seeing national level consolidation of an authoritarian threat right now. A lot of times it's like this either or. Should it be national? Should it be local? The framework in my mind starts with an acknowledgement of both and thinking. We are both working with groups that are very grassroots, and we are working with groups that can link the grassroots to the national. The framework that we use is a framework that takes a justice-seeking approach around our historic harms that bleed into our current harms, that we have to acknowledge where and how injustices continue to be allowed to happen, so that those who are in a justice-seeking mode and those who might want to find each other in a kind of dialogical approach to like deep listening and finding each other across difference so that we have empathy with each other again and civic friendship, or that those are sequenced in a way that those who are on the receiving end of harms feel the solidarity, that we are actually acknowledging that those harms are happening or have happened, and in order to then be able to move towards a reconciliation process, a process of finding each other across difference, an agreement of non-repetition. This is the term that is used internationally, that there are some preconditions. We don't start with dialogue, and dialogue isn't the only way forward. So those are some contours of a framework, I guess I would say.
First of all, people have to agree to come together and to stop the hostilities. When you begin to talk about the resistance work, for example, that piece is actually right up front. I think that resistance piece is the motivator, but there's got to be an acknowledgement and people held accountable. I've been thinking about the dialogue process, the logics of truth, which is a phrase that I've taken from my dear friend Leonel Nevares, who's down in Bogota, and develop a certain kind of dialogue where people basically say, okay, this is what happened from my perspective. This is what happened from your perspective. Why did these events happen? How do we overcome what has happened? And then we can move on to how do we heal as a community, which is the restorative justice piece that the group decides on what that really looks like. We go only then into, okay, are we ready to really change our mindsets about one another and work with the emotional, the anger, the hatred? Because when we're starting to do that kind of work, people have to really look at themselves.
There is an element that I would add to your sequencing of the process. It's something that we as a country are just really struggling with, and we have since our founding, which is to bring in the historic memory.
Mhm.
So if people come together and say, this is how I'm experiencing things right now, this is how you're experiencing things right now, we need to come to some kind of mutual understanding of the different life experiences to then find a way forward. It's asking a lot of certain communities to come to that process without, I talked about agreement of non-repetition. So if we want to talk about police brutality and we want to talk about our way forward for a safe community where everybody thrives, you can't have that conversation without acknowledging and looking for accountability around over policing, for example, or over incarceration in certain communities. But that's the bare minimum that you have to do is the modern expression of a historic harm of certain communities, a through line to our history of colonization and slavery that for whatever reason we're having the hardest time as a society addressing. And the reason that we can't move forward is because we haven't brought that meaningfully in to societal conversations, political conversations. And we see right now just a complete backlash to an acknowledgement of even the need for that. So we're trying to erase histories now. So I guess in the sequencing that you just described, Eileen, I think it's so important to say that there is a historic context that infuses the positionality of how people come in to share their lived experience. And not everyone will be ready or should be asked to come to a political forgiveness dialogue configuration or container. Because what really also needs to happen in our society is containers for grief and for that grief to be expressed in a safe place
Mhm.
where I'm not being asked to incorporate other people's lived experiences. And I feel like that's another container that is given short shrift. We want to move forward together. We want to forgive each other. We want to find each other again across these lines of difference. And so, can't we just get over that history part, get over the grief part, so that we can move forward to start empathizing with each other? I do feel like the spaces for righteous outrage and grief to also be held and honored within communities that feel that deeply to then prepare for whatever you're talking about, which is to find each other across difference, to hear each other's different lived experience, to then get to an agreement around moving forward together. And in my experience in the bridge building community, for example, sometimes we're focused so much on dialogue that we forget and we want to move too quickly through some of these other phases.
You bring up some really important points, and some of it is actually misconceptions that a lot of the public probably has about what forgiveness really is. And it really does take time. It's understanding our humanity that begins to open the door to a more profound healing. What you and I are talking about is really deep cultural change. My question here is, how do we work with leaders who are allowed to work within this system still causing harm? What are your thoughts on that?
Honestly, I've been really impacted by my collaboration with my co-lead, Maria Stefan at Horizons, who is a civil resistance scholar and an organizer. Those who are allowed to divide us as a political project need to be stood up to. It's a time for courage, to put it more bluntly. And what we're really struggling with right now is obviously living in our different bubbles and all the different information. And how do we love our neighbors? How do we create beloved community? How do we acknowledge those who are just living in a completely different worldview than us and call them in to a future where they also belong? But also hold leaders accountable for the toxic othering that they're engaging in. And a lot of the work then becomes also within our in-group because we need to do the deep organizing work within faith communities, within the business community, within veterans groups and other groups in order to engage with folks in these conversations around what is moral clarity in this moment and to not fear those conversations as being overly polarizing or politicizing because we know we have to stay engaged, but we absolutely have to be able to call out our leaders and hold them accountable. And this is how authoritarianism works, Eileen, is people of good faith get quieter and quieter, especially within their in groups, because, the social norms shift and you see the people who do stand up for their values become ostracized and or targets of political violence or threats or intimidation. And we're seeing this now. And so the way of doing this is through solidarity networks so that we see that finally there's this mutual defense pact with the universities who are saying if one university is going to be attacked, we will all stand up, that Rutgers University is helping to broker. We need those types of solidarity networks so that when a pastor of a conservative church stands up against any kind of white Christian nationalism elements within a congregation or a denomination, that they actually have a place of safety and solidarity to be held for that courage and not just get ostracized from their congregation and lose their livelihood and their friends and their family. And so I think it's through building our solidarity networks and our solidarity muscles by organizing together across many lines of difference that we will shift the political calculations of the current leaders who are leading us down a path of toxic othering and fear and scapegoating and the things the majority of the country don't want.
There are groups that are standing up who are not afraid, but there are other groups that block that. How do we deal with that?
There's a ton of resources on making threats and intimidation and political violence backfire. This is what the civil rights movement did beautifully, is when they walked across the bridge in Selma and were met by the resistance and the brutality. This was a moment that the rest of the country woke up and said, oh my gosh, how can this stand? And there was a shift. There was a shift in the moral clarity of the country. These are the kinds of shifts that we need. I'm inspired by Northern New York, where kids and their mothers are taken by ICE agents and illegally detained without due process. And the teachers and the principal who said, our kids were just taken out of school, organized with their community, were in the news, organizing protests, calling every day, eventually got the kids released. The mother. So folks are standing up and saying, absolutely not. So it's everyday people, but then obviously we also want to encourage our political leaders to take a stand. And there's a lot of Republican leaders that are standing up for farmers who are on the receiving end of the tariff policies and losing a ton of money in rural America. So we need to incentivize those acts of courage and help to make the acts of harassment and intimidation backfire. And I'm happy to send you a guide that we have on that. We do a whole training on backfire principles so that communities can organize around really, again, shifting the calculation and making bystanders become upstanders.
That's really great work. And of course, in the show notes, I would like to include all of that. You just talked about the civil rights movement. There's so much there that we can all learn, because what many people at least cherished was the Constitution and the democratic principles within the Constitution, which to me is what really is the backbone of this country. And many people don't understand that.
No, I don't disagree with you. We talk a ton about the need for kind of massive popular education around both our responsibilities as citizens, but also to understand the moment that we're in and our agency that we have to do something about it. I would also just impress upon you the importance of social norms. It behooves us to not just go through formal education, but to embody what we're talking about. And I'll give you a really specific example. There's a whole movement online that is making fun of folks who voted for the current administration being on the receiving end of harms of the current policies. And there's a hashtag, there's F around and find out. So FAFO, do you know what I'm talking about?
Mhm.
And it's a whole ecosystem. It's very gratifying to be able to say, I told you so, and super unhelpful. It's like one of the more unhelpful things that we can be doing right now, which is to essentially say, you should be marinating in your pain because you voted this way and I can't forgive you for it.
Mhm.
And so those who are coming to a new place of, oh, okay, I'd actually now like to be a part of a different future for my country, we need to create those on-ramps. And so this kind of F around and find out movement is horrible. And for actors that I work with, we're constantly trying to say, please don't say that. We need to welcome people into the broadest movement for the future of our country. And if people are having either a change of heart or experiencing harms and need that kind of solidarity to understand that, yes, government is meant to work for all of us and is an important element of how we show up for each other as communities and citizens. And so, yes, if you're having like this awakening of the importance of the role of government funding and otherwise programs, we're all for reform. Let's improve it. Loretta Ross has also just a great way of putting it in her calling in class and her TED Talk. We should include that in the notes. But if people want to give up hate, you have to be there for them when they do. And that feels like a big ask sometimes, but that's going to be what's going to get us out of this mess.
And that's what's going to give us unity because all voices need to be heard. And even those that may have voted for this administration, they had their reasons, and some of it may have been valid. So we have to listen to one another in this regard.
It goes both ways, Eileen. I find myself bristling a little bit at the word unity, only because of the way it's been weaponized a little bit
Mhm.
to erase some very legitimate feelings of folks like the 92% of Black women who stood up and voted for Kamala and now are saying, we're tired. We don't want to do this work anymore. It's up to the rest of you to solve this problem. Peace out. We're going to be taking care of ourselves, which is a whole movement in and of itself. And if you want to say we need to listen to everyone, we need to find each other a common ground, we need unity in this moment, there will be whole swaths of people who will say, I am not up for that. That sounds exhausting to me. You might go and do some of that unity work, go team. I am not going to do that unity work. I'm going to take care of my people. If you want to ask some of the trans rights groups to be doing unity work right now, they are taking care of their people. They are making sure that like the networks of healthcare and like deep psychological support for our friends who are suffering and the parents networks of trans kids. These are people who don't need unity. And in
Mhm.
fact, it's okay. And this is in our organizing work, the complexity of positionality, the complexity of stories that we tell ourselves about what's most needed, that's what we actually need. We need to be able to hold a container for all of the diversity of positions without coming to some unified approach to the change making that requires of us to find unity in this moment and still believe in the future that we're hoping for, but going to be working towards differently. Because this is the problem, I think, with the brand forgiveness, by the way. And I want to share this with you with deep love and respect for what you're doing is when you say we need political forgiveness, there are so many people that hear that and say, yeah, thanks very much, but I am not there.
Mhm.
And we need to have space for those people in our movement as well, because we won't move forward if we shame people for not being ready to be there yet.
Really good points to think about, and it really does speak to the complexity of where people are at. I know that you worked with the Rotary in a forgiveness training program. How did things go with that? What did you learn?
I've worked with Rotary for more than 10 years on different aspects of their peace building programs internationally, their fellowship programs where they send and pay for students to get master's programs in peace and conflict resolution. So it's an organization that I really know intimately. And so when one of their members gifted Rotary a grant to create a program on forgiveness, they reached out to me and asked if I wouldn't help them design it. And what was really great before this member passed on, because it was a parting gift from his estate, we were able to discuss the fact that he really felt deeply about embedding forgiveness within the ethos and culture of Rotary and Rotary clubs, because there's such social capital all over the world with that infrastructure. But I was able to say, I'm very inspired to do this with Rotary as long as we don't just stay at the individual forgiveness level, but we also incorporate societal healing into the course as well. And he agreed with that. And then that became more coherent with Horizon's mission. And we put together a little brain trust as folks who think deeply about forgiveness and societal healing. And you were really generous of your time to be a part of that. So we had some really great thinkers to help us think through how to create an online course that led Rotary members from around the world through a process of thinking about their own relationship to forgiveness, circumstances at an individual level that would see the benefits, the personal kind of health benefits, all of the reasons we know that it's good for us to forgive and that it doesn't necessarily require reconciliation. But then also to then translate those concepts to our role as society and all of the things that you and I have been talking about, the sequencing and when and how certain cultures have done it. Nobody has done it perfectly, these kind of national truth and reconciliation and justice seeking processes, but we've learned a lot from them. And those that have been committed to a process of justice seeking and community care and group healing processes. And there's so many great options, whether it's circle processes or other forms of group healing. And so it's an online course that I think is going very well. There's a facilitation toolkit that goes along with it. So the members of Rotary go through the course and then want to have further conversations within their clubs. We even have a checklist of designing a forgiveness and or societal healing project, because Rotarians are really into their own community organizing and volunteer work, and so what those types of projects might look like. And then I was able to pilot a couple of in-person workshops with Rotarians here outside of the DC area, and they went really well. People go deep quickly if you create the right space and grapple with exactly the things that you and I have been grappling with about how this bumps into concepts of justice seeking and accountability and truth seeking, and when and how the right conditions are met for group forgiveness.
If there's one thing that you would like to leave this audience with, what would it be?
I can imagine that you have an audience of folks that are already convinced about the power of forgiveness. And I guess the thing that I would invite your audience to engage with is curiosity around why some of their neighbors and community members might not be ready yet. Because I see sometimes within the community of folks, of peace builders or healers, they really believe deeply in finding each other across difference to get to the reconciliation part, and might even be judgmental of those, or even contemptuous, quite honestly, of those who are still in resistance mode and raising the heat and being disruptive as being counterproductive to their healing efforts. A lot of those folks might be asking for curiosity across difference. Once we get to the table, you need to be curious about why people are experiencing the world differently. And I think those of us who are working in the field of peace building and societal healing need the same grace and curiosity around those who aren't there yet, and to allow for that to be okay. In fact, it's more than okay right now. It's absolutely a legitimate feeling. This is a long-term process, and to hopefully train our curiosity on the full range of emotions that people are feeling, and then the tactics that they're using to demand for harms to stop now.
Because when you're really curious, it also means that you're willing to put down some of your own barriers to really listen. If people would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
We have a website at the Horizons Project, so it's horizonsproject.us, and you can sign up for our newsletter. We have a monthly Vista that goes out, and you can definitely find me there. And I'm super on LinkedIn all the time. I live on LinkedIn, unfortunately. So if you find Julia Roig on LinkedIn, that's a good way to find me too.
I hope people really do check out your website and the Vista newsletter. It's wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia, for graciously giving of your time, your wisdom, and sharing your expertise. I love the depth of your thinking.
Thanks very much, Eileen. It was a pleasure. Great to speak to you.
Thank you for joining us in listening to Political Forgiveness, Voices of Peace, where I hope you were inspired by the work of forgiveness in creating social change. If you know of anyone who would find this episode helpful, please share it. For more information on political forgiveness, please visit my website, drboris.com, where you can find all the resources mentioned in the podcast, as well as sign up for the newsletter with the latest information on political forgiveness.